I think you should ask for VP Pence's conversation, because he had a couple of conversations also. I could save you a lot of time. They were all perfect.
Vice President Mike Pence's name has been dropped in the Ukraine scandal. During an address at the UN Assembly, President Trump told reporters to ask the Vice President about his conversations with Ukraine.
Meanwhile, the Vice President is defending POTUS, of course, telling Fox Business he believes Democrats are trying to overturn the election. A new book is focusing exclusively on the VP, Piety and Power. Mike Pence and the taking of the White House details the Vice President's career and his possible future. Joining us to discuss the book and the Vice President is author of Piety and Power, Tom LoBianco. Great to see you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Why did you think it was important to dig into Mike Pence, who he is and what animates him?
I really wanted to understand, so I've been covering him since 2011, and I really wanted to understand how he got here and where he's headed, because it's clear, look, he's young. He got on the Trump train. He knows, he understands where the Republican base is, and he has his own future in mind at this point. 2024 is clearly in their sights. So I wanted to understand more about him because he's an important figure in American history.
Well, what do you think he's been the most consequential on so far in our history?
Getting Trump elected. Seriously.
Yeah.
Because look at your options that you had for VP at that point. And this is backed up by the reporting. I've reported for the first time that one of the Trump pollsters, the main Trump pollster, Tony Fabrizio, at that moment, they had numbers on Christie, Gingrich, and Pence. Pence was the only one who elevated them by bringing conservatives home and evangelicals home. And let me make this point clear, because this is something that I didn't understand before, and I found out the more I spent more time understanding his own religion. It's not the televangelists, not the folks like Jerry Falwell Jr. and Pat Robertson who were on board with Trump early in the election, relatively speaking. It's your quiet Midwestern evangelicals. Sure. That's who he brought home.
Right.
And he lifts Trump over the line, especially in the Rust Belt.
How does he square his faith and, he says that's what he is first. He's a Christian first, right? How does he square that with the president's personal life?
There's two anecdotes that his friends and advisors told me, two biblical allegories that lay this out. And they both go to keeping government and keeping the country on the track. The first one is the Old Testament, Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, the Persian king. And in this case, Daniel is the faithful servant to God. Nebuchadnezzar, very much an ungodly man, put there to keep his people safe. The other one is Joseph and the Pharaoh. And again, it's the Jews, you have a Jewish slave, the Old Testament, a tyrant, put there by God. It's not a godly leader, but a person, an implement of God, put there to keep everything safe for his people, to protect his people. Those are the two that I heard, which really made a lot of sense. And it goes to, if you remember the anonymous New York Times op-ed, that's, a year ago now.
Right.
I almost forgot about it.
Yeah.
That anonymous New York Times op-ed kind of lays out the same claim, which is we are the resistance inside the White House, keeping the country on track, which I think is the other, aside from Lodestar.
Is that really how he thinks about it, though? Look, I actually know some of his staff. I've met Pence a couple of times. I don't think that that's how he looks at himself. He doesn't look at himself as like a resistance figure, but he does look at himself as somebody who executes on what the president gives him. And he does very much, I think, look at himself as, a number two to President Trump. Now, you say here in the book that he's got quite a bit of ambition and hunger for power, which has outweighed anything else. What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Why is it mutually exclusive?
Let me go back to your first point.
Yeah.
I don't think that he's resistance, and I do think that, as best I can tell, that nobody actually knows. Well, a few people know who the anonymous op-ed writer was.
Yeah.
He's not resistance. What he is doing is faithful servant. That's where he's at. And in this case, it's faithful servant to Trump, faithful servant to God. And you hear this often from people like Mark Short, this servant attitude, servant leadership. But to your second point, I'm sorry, ask that question again.
You said
saying?
that he has ambition and hunger for power has outweighed anything else. What is anything else? What did you mean by that?
there's a point in his history. So, and let me debunk a myth here around him. You've heard reporting that he's predestined for the presidency. They believe they're predestined for the presidency. That's not their faith, and that's not how they view it. When you put together his chronology, what you see is he starts really working towards the White House in 2008. After the 2008 election, the Council for National Policy, conservative umbrella group, a lot of what we would call movement conservatives, people like Heritage Foundation, founded by Tim LaHaye,
Tony Perkins.
Yep, everybody. They decide at a meeting at Brent Bozell's house in Virginia, they decide that they're not going to have Mitt Romney. They already, immediately after McCain, they see Romney down the road. They want a conservative. Pence's name comes up. They bring him in for a meeting. And he just knocks it out of the park. And this goes to his style of politics, how he practices politics, how he succeeds. It's not because he's some incredible speaker. It's not because he is, super charismatic, dynamic, bold, visionary. It's because he knows everybody in the room personally. He's incredible at retail.
So there's an active debate almost since the birth of the Trump presidency over who would be worse. Donald Trump on the left, right? From the Democratic perspective, who would be worse? Donald Trump or Mike Pence? What did you learn about what a Pence presidency and administration would actually look like?
Sure. So I wrote about this for the Washington Post and out today. We talk a little bit about, I think, and based on my reporting, I think you would have just a more conservative version of George W. Bush. Yeah. I think you'd have a reversion to
more conservative in terms of fiscal politics, in terms of social politics, in terms of everything.
Yes, in those terms. yes.
Everything.
Sorry.
Okay.
Take him, move him to the right. I do think this, though. I think you would see a return to more neoconservative foreign policy, with the and you would not see a return to the two-state solution because he is very clearly aligned with Israel, and that's while he does not himself firmly ensconce in the Christian right and the Pat Robertson world, he does line up with them completely on certain areas, and Israel is one of those areas, and he's been that throughout in his entire career.
Interesting.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Tom. Congrats.
Thank you.
Coming up on Rising, in our interview with Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, she asked which candidates have made the case to not just be president, but commander-in-chief.
We'll put that question to Team Rising when we return.